Oh, here we are, Thursday, November 17th, 2022. I'm Larissa, and we are reading John Steinbeck's To a God Unknown. Chapter 15. It was early in November when the rain came. Every day in the morning, Joseph searched the sky, studying the bulky, rearing clouds, and again at evening he watched the sinking sun reddening the sky. And he thought of those prophetic nursery rhymes, red sky at morning, sailors take warning, red sky at night, sailors delight, and the other way around, red sky at morning, rain before dawning, red sky at night, clear days in sight. He looked at the barometer more often than the clock, and when the needle swung down and down, he was very happy. He went into the yard and whispered to the tree, "Rain in a few days now, it'll wash the dust off the leaves." One day he shot a chicken hawk, and it hung its head downward high in the branches of the oak tree, and he took to watching the horses and the chickens closely. Thomas laughed at him. "You won't bring it any quicker. You're watching the kettle, Joe. You may keep the rain away if you're too anxious." And Thomas said, "I'm going to kill a pig in the morning." "I'll hang a crossbar in the oak tree by my house and hang him on," said Joseph. "Rama will make the sausage, won't she?" Elizabeth hid her head under the pillow while the pig was screaming, but Rama stood by and caught the throat blood in a milk bucket. And they weren't too soon, for the sides and hams were hardly in the new little stone smokehouse before the rain came. There was no maneuvering this time. The wind blew fiercely for a morning out of the southwest and the ocean, and the clouds rolled in and spread and dropped low until the mountaintops were hidden, and then the fat drops fell. The children stood in Rama's house and watched from the window. Burton gave thanks and helped his wife to give thanks, too, although she wasn't well. Thomas went to the barn and sat on a manger and listened to the rain on the barn roof. The piled hay was still warm with the sun of the summer slopes. The horses moved their feet restlessly and, twisting their heads against the halter ropes, tried to sniff the outside air through the little manure windows. Joseph was standing under the oak tree when the rain started. The pig's blood he had dabbled on the bark was black and shiny. Elizabeth called to him from the porch. "It's coming now. You'll get wet." And he turned a laughing face to her. "My skin is dry," he called. "I want to get wet." He saw the first big drops fall, thudding on dust in little spurts. Then the ground was peppered with black drops. The rain thickened and a fresh wind slanted it. The sharp smell of dampened dust rose into the air. And the first winter storm really began, raking through the air and drumming the roofs and knocking the weak leaves from the trees. The ground darkened. Little rivulets started to edge out across the yard. Joseph stood with his head uplifted while the rain beat on his cheeks and on his eyelids, and the water coursed into his beard and dripped into his open shirt collar, and his clothes hung heavily against him. He stood in the rain a long time to make sure it was not a little piddling shower. Elizabeth called again, "Joseph, you'll take cold." "No cold in this," he said. "This is healthy." "You'll sprout weeds, then, out of your hair. Joseph, come in. There's a good fire going. Come in and change your clothes." But still he stood in the rain, and only when the streaks of water were running down the oak trunk did he go in. "It will be a good year," he said. "The canyon streams will be flowing before Thanksgiving." Elizabeth sat in the big leather chair and had put a stew in simmering on the airtight stove. She laughed when he came in. There was such a feeling of joy in the air. "Why, you're dripping water on the floor, all over the clean floor." "I know," he said, and he felt such a love for the land and for Elizabeth that he strode across the room and rested his wet hand on her hair in a kind of benediction. "Joseph, you're dripping water down my neck." "I know," he said. "Joseph, your hand is cold. When I was confirmed, the bishop laid his hand on my head as you were doing, and his hand was cold. It ran shivers down my back. I thought it was the Holy Spirit." She smiled happily up at him. "We talked about it afterwards, and all the other girls said it was the Holy Spirit. It was a long time ago, Joseph." She thought back to it, and in the middle of her long, narrow picture of time lay the white pass in the mountains, and even it was a long way back in the picture of time. He leaned over quickly and kissed her on the cheek. "The grass will be up in 2 weeks," he said. "Joseph, there's nothing in the world as unpleasant as a wet beard. Your dry clothes are laid out on the bed, dear." During the evening he sat in his rocking chair beside the window. Elizabeth stole glances at his face, saw him frown with apprehension when the rain's drumming lightened, and smile slightly with reassurance when it continued again, harder than ever. Late in the evening Thomas came in, kicking and scraping his feet on the front porch. "Well, it came all right," Joseph said. "Yes, it came. Tomorrow we'll have to dig some ditches. The corral is under water. We'll have to drain it. There's good manure in that water, Tom. We'll run it down over the vegetable flat." The rain continued for a week, sometimes thinning to a mist and then pouring again. The drops bent down the old dead grass, and in a few days the new tiny spears came out. The river rumbled out of the western hills and rose over its banks, combing the willows down into the water and growling among the boulders. Every little canyon and crease in the hills sent out a freshet to join the river. The water cuts deepened and spread in all the gullies. The children playing in the houses and in the barn grew heartily sick of it before it was done. They plagued Rama for methods of amusement. The women had begun to complain about damp clothes hung up in their kitchens. Joseph, dressed in an oilskin, and spent his days walking about the farm, now twisting a post-hole digger into the earth to see how deep the wet had gone, now strolling by the riverbank, watching the brush and the logs and limbs go bobbing by. At night he slept lightly, listening to the rain or dozing, only to awaken when its force diminished. And then one morning the sky was clean and the sun shone warmly. The washed air was sweet and clear, and all the leaves on the live oaks glittered with polish. And the grass was coming, anyone could see it, a richness in the color of the farther hills, a shade of blue in the near distance, and right at hand the tiny green needles poking through the soil. The children broke out of their cages like animals and played so furiously that they became feverish and had to go to bed. Joseph brought out a plow and turned over the soil of the vegetable flat, and Thomas harrowed it, and Burton rolled it. It was like a procession, each man eager to get his claws into the soil. Even the children begged a bit of dirt for radishes and carrots. Radishes were quickest, but carrots made the finest-looking garden, if only they would wait that long. And all the time the grass pushed up and up. Needles became blades, and each blade sprang apart and made two blades. The ridges and flanks of the hills grew soft and smooth and voluptuous again, and the sage lost its dour darkness. In all the country, only the pine grove on the eastern ridge kept to its brooding. Thanksgiving came with a great feast, and well before Christmas the grass was ankle-high. One afternoon, an old Mexican peddler walked into the farmyard, and he had good things in his pack. Needles and pins and thread and little lumps of beeswax and holy pictures and a box of gum and harmonicas and rolls of red and green crepe paper. He was an old bent man and carried only little things. He opened his pack on Elizabeth's front porch and then stood back smiling apologetically, now and then turning over a card of pins to make it show to better advantage, or prodding the gum gently with his forefinger to gain the attention of the gathered women. Joseph, from the barn door, saw the little crowd and sauntered over. Only then did the old man take off his tattered hat. "Buenas tardes, senor," he said. "Tardes," said Joseph. The peddler grinned in extreme embarrassment. "You do not remember me, senor?" Joseph searched the dark-lined face. "I guess I don't." "One day," the old man said, "you rode by on the way from Nuestra Senora. I thought you were going hunting, and I begged a piece of venison." "Yes," Joseph said slowly, "I remember now. You are old, Juan." The peddler tipped his head like an aged bird. "And then, senor?" "And then we spoke of a fiesta. I have been on my way down the country, below San Luis Obispo. Did you take that fiesta, senor?" Joseph's eyes opened delightedly. "No, I did not, but I will. What would be a good time, old Juan?" The peddler spread his hands and pulled his neck between his shoulders at having so much honor put on him. "Why, senor, in this country any time is good, but some days are better. There is Christmas, the Natividad." "No," Joseph said, "it's too soon. There won't be time." "Then there is New Year, senor. That is the best time, because then everyone is happy and people go about looking for a fiesta." "That's it," Joseph cried. "On New Year's Day we'll have it. My son-in-law plays the guitar, senor." "He shall come too. Who shall I invite, old Juan?" "Invite?" The old man's eyes filled with astonishment. "You do not invite, senor. When I go back to Nuestra Senora, I will tell that you make a fiesta on the New Year, and the people will come. Maybe the priest will come, with his altar and the saddlebags, and hold the mass. That would be beautiful." Joseph laughed up into the oak tree. "The grass will be so high by then," he said. 16. The day after Christmas, Martha, Rama's oldest girl, gave the other children a bad fright. "It will rain for fiesta," she said, and because she was older than the others, a serious child who used her age and her seriousness as a whip on the other children, they believed her and felt very badly about it. The grass was deep. A spell of warm weather had sent it shooting up, and there were millions of mushrooms in the fields, and puffballs and toadstools too. The children brought buckets of mushrooms in, which Rama fried in a pan containing a silver spoon to test them for poison. And She said the silver would turn black if a toadstool was present. 2 days before New Year's, old Juan appeared along the road, and his son-in-law, a smiling, shiftless Mexican boy, walked directly behind him, for the son-in-law, Manuel, did not even like to take the responsibility of keeping out of ditches. The two of them stood smiling in front of Joseph's porch, caressing their hats against their chests. Manuel did everything old Juan did, as a puppy imitates a grown dog. He plays the guitar, old Juan said, and in proof Manuel shifted the battered instrument around from his back and displayed it while he grinned agonizingly. I told about the fiesta, old Juan continued. The people will come. 4 more guitars, senor, and Father Angelo will come. Here was the fine, successful thing. And he will hold mass right here, and I, he said proudly, I am to build the altar. Father Angelo said so. Burton's eyes grew sullen then. Joseph, you won't have that, will you? Not on our ranch. Not with the name we've always had. But Joseph was smiling joyfully. They are our neighbors, Burton, and I don't want to convert them. I won't stay to see it, Burton cried angrily. I'll give no sanction to the Pope on this land. Thomas chuckled. You stay in the house then, Burton. Joe and I aren't afraid of being converted, so we'll watch it. There were 1,000 things to be done. Thomas drove a wagon to Nuestra Senora and bought a barrel of red wine and a keg of whiskey. The vaqueros butchered 3 steers and hung the meat in the trees, and Manuel sat under the trees to keep the vermin off. Old Juan built an altar of boards under the great oak, and Joseph leveled and swept a dancing place in the farmyard. Old Juan was every place, showing the women how to make a tub of salsa pura. They had to use preserved tomatoes and chili and green peppers and some dried herbs that old Juan carried in his pocket. He directed the digging of the cooking pits and carried the seasoned oak wood to the edges. Under the meat trees, Manuel sat tiredly plucking the strings of his guitar, now and then breaking into a feverish melody. The children inspected everything and were good, for Rama had let it be known that a bad child would stay in the house and see the fiesta from a window, a punishment so staggering that the children carried wood to the barbecue pits and offered to help Manuel watch the meat. The guitars arrived at 9 o'clock on New Year's Eve. 4 lank brown men with black, straight hair and beautiful hands. They could ride 40 miles, play their guitars for a day and a night, and ride 40 miles home again. They staggered with exhaustion after 15 minutes behind a plow. With their arrival, Manuel came to life. He helped them to hang their precious saddlebags out of harm, and he spread their blankets for them on the hay, but they didn't sleep long. At 3 o'clock in the night, old Juan built the fires in the pits, and then the guitars came out carrying their saddlebags. They set 4 posts around the dancing place and took the fine things out of the saddlebags, red and blue bunting and paper lanterns and ribbons. They worked in the leaping light from the barbecue pits and, well before day, had built a pavilion. Before daylight, Father Angelo arrived on a mule, followed by a hugely packed horse and 2 sleepy altar boys riding together on a burro. Father Angelo went directly to work. He spread the service on old Juan's altar, set up the candles, slapped the altar boys, and set them running about. He laid the vestments out in a tool shed and, last of all, brought out his figures. They were wonderful things, a crucifix and a mother and child. Father Angelo had carved and painted them himself, and he had invented their peculiarities. They folded in the middle on hinges so carefully hidden that when they were set up, the crack would not be seen, their heads screwed on, and the child fitted into the mother's arms with a peg that went into a slot. Father Angelo loved his figures, and they were very, very famous. Although they were 3 feet high, when folded, both could fit into a saddlebag. Besides being interestingly mechanically, they were blessed and had the complete sanction of the Archbishop. Old Juan had made separate stands for them, and he himself had brought a thick candle for the altar. Before sunup, the guests began to arrive. Some of the richer families in surreys with swaying top fringes, the others in carts, buggies, wagons, and on horseback. The poor whites came down from their Scrabble ranch on King's Mountain on a sled half filled with straw and completely filled with children. The children arrived in droves, and for a time stood about and stared at each other. The Indians walked up quietly and stood apart with stolid and curious faces, watching everything and never taking part in anything. Are you quite finished? Thank you. Father Angelo was a stern man where the church was concerned, but once out of the church, and with the matters of the church out of the way, he was a tender and humorous man. Let him get a mouthful of meat and a cup of wine in his hand, and there were no eyes that could twinkle more brightly than his. Promptly at 8 o'clock, he lighted the candles, drove out the altar boys, and began the mass. His big voice rumbled beautifully. Burton, true to his promise, remained in the house and held prayer with his wife, but even though he raised his voice, he could not drown out the penetrating Latin. As soon as the Mass was done, people gathered close to watch Father Angelo fold up the Christ and the Mary. He did it well, genuflecting before each one before he took it down and unscrewed its head. The pits were rosy with coals by now, and the pit sides glowed under the heat. Thomas, with more help than he needed, rolled the wine barrel up on a cradle and set a spigot in its end and knocked the bung out. The huge pieces of meat hung over the fire and dripped their juices, and the coals jetted up with white fire. There was prime beef killed on the range and hung. 3 men brought the rub of salsa out and went back for a wash boiler full of beans. The women carried sour bread and like armloads of wood and stacked the golden loaves on the table. The Indians on the outskirts edged in closer, and the children, playing by now but still diffident, became a little insane with hunger when the meat smells began to fill the air. To start the fiesta, Joseph did a ceremonial thing old Juan had told him about, a thing so ancient and so natural that Joseph seemed to remember it. He took a tin cup from the table and went to the wine cask. The red wine sang and sparkled into it. When it was full, he raised the cup level with his eyes, then poured it on the ground. Again he filled the cup, and this time he drank it in 4 thirsty gulps. Father Angelo nodded his head and smiled at the fine way in which the thing was done. When his ceremony was finished, Joseph walked to the tree and poured a little wine on its bark, and he heard the priest's voice speaking softly beside him. "This is not a good thing to do, my son." Joseph whirled on him. "What do you mean?" "There was a fly in the cup." But Father Angelo smiled wisely and a little sadly at him. "Be careful of the groves, my son. Jesus is a better Savior than a hamadryad." And his smile became tender, for Father Angelo was a wise as well as a learned man. Joseph started to turn rudely away, but then uncertainly he swung back. "Do you understand everything, Father?" "No, my son," the priest said. "I understand very little, but the Church understands everything. Perplexing things become simple in the Church, and I understand this thing you do." Father Angelo continued gently. "In this way, the devil has owned this country for many thousands of years, Christ for a very few, and as in a newly conquered nation, the old customs are practiced a long time, sometimes secretly, and sometimes changing slightly to comply with the tenor of the new rule. So here, my son, some of the old habits persist, even under the dominion of Christ." Joseph said, "Thank you. The meat is ready now, I think." I'm going to sneeze. Joseph said, "Thank you. The meat is ready now, I think." At the pits, the helpers were turning chunks of beef with pitchforks, and the guests, holding tin cups in their hands, had formed a line to the wine cask. First to be served were the guitars, and they drank whiskey, for the sun was high and their work was to be done. They wolfed their food, and while the other people were still eating, the guitars sat on boxes in half circle and played softly, bringing their rhythms together, feeling for a mood, so that when the dancing started, they might be one passionate instrument. Old Juan, knowing the temper of music, kept their cups full of whiskey. Now 2 couples entered the dancing place and stepped steadily through a formal dance, all bowing and slow turning. The guitars ran trilling melodies into the throb of the beat. The line to the wine barrel formed again, and more couples entered the dancing space, these not so clever as the first few. The guitars sensed the change and took more heavily to the bass strings, and the rhythm grew stout and pounding. The space was filling now with guests who took little care to dance, but standing arm in arm, thudded their feet on the earth. At the pits, the Indians moved up and thanklessly took the bread and meat that was offered. They moved closer to the dancers then, and gnawed the meat and tore at the hard bread in their teeth. As the rhythm grew heavy and insistent, the Indians shuffled their feet in time, and their faces remained blank. The music did not stop. On it went, and on, pounding and unchanging. Now and then one of the players plucked the unstopped strings, while his left hand sought his whiskey cup. Now and then a dancer left the space to move to the wine barrel, toss off a cup, and hurry back. There was no dancing in couples any more. Arms were outstretched to embrace everyone within reach, and knees were bent and feet pounded the earth to the slow beating of the guitars. The dancers began in low humming. One note struck deep in the throat, an in-off beat. A quarter tone came in. More and more voices took up the beat and the quarter tone. Whole sections of the packed dancing space were bobbing to the rhythm. The humming grew savage and deep and vibrant where at first there had been laughter and shouted jokes. One man had been notable for his height, another for the deepness of his voice. One woman had been beautiful, another ugly and fat, but that was changing. The dancers lost identity. Faces grew rapt, shoulders fell slightly forward. Each person became a part of the dancing body, and the soul of the body was the rhythm. The guitars sat like demons, slitted eyes glittering, conscious of their power, yet dreaming of greater power, and the strings rang on together. Manuel, who had grinned and smirked from embarrassment in the morning, threw back his head and howled a high, shrill minor bar with meaningless words. The dancers chanted a deep refrain. The next player added his segment, and the chant answered him. The sun wheeled past meridian and slanted towards the hills, and a high wind soughed out of the west. The dancers, one by one, went back for meat and wine. Joseph, with glowing eyes, stood apart. His feet moved slightly with the throbbing, and he felt tied to the dancing body, but he did not join it. He thought exultantly, "We have found something here, all of us. In some way, we've come closer to the earth for a moment." He was strong with a pleasure as deep and as pounding as bass strings, and he began to feel a strange faith arising in him. Something will come of this. It's kind of a powerful prayer. When he looked at the western hills and saw a black cloud head, high and ominous, coming over from the sea, he knew what was to come. Of course, he said, it will bring rain. Something must happen when such a charge of prayer is let loose. He watched with confidence while the towering cloud grew over the mountains and stalked upward toward the sun. Thomas had gone into the barn when the dancing started, for he was afraid of the wild emotion as an animal is afraid of thunder. The rhythm came into the barn to him now, and he stroked a horse's neck to soothe himself. After a time, he heard a soft sobbing near him. Walked toward it, found Burton kneeling in a stall, whimpering and praying. Then Thomas laughed and caught himself back from fear. "What's the matter, Burton? Don't you like the fiesta?" Burton cried angrily. "It's devil worship, I tell you. It's horrible. On our own place. First the devil-worshipping priest and his wooden idols, and then this." "What does it remind you of, Burton?" Thomas asked innocently. "Remind me of? It reminds me of witchcraft and the Black Sabbath. It reminds me of all the devilish heathen practices in the world." Thomas said, "Go on with your praying, Burton. Do you know what it puts me in mind of? Why, only listen to your ears half open. It's like a camp meeting. It's like a great evangelist enlightening the people." "It's devil worship," Burton cried again. "It's unclean devil worship, I tell you. If I had known, I would have gone away." Thomas laughed harshly and went back to sit on his manger, and he listened to Burton's praying. It pleased Thomas to hear how Burton's supplication fell into the rhythm of the guitars. As Joseph watched the swollen black cloud, it seemed not to move, and yet it was eating up the sky, and all suddenly it caught and ate the sun. And so thick and powerful was the cloud that the day went to dusk, and the mountains radiated a metallic light, hard and sharp. A moment after the sun had gone, a golden lace of lightning shot from the cloud, and the thunder ran, stumbling and falling, over the mountain tops. Another quiver of light, and a plunge of thunder. The music and the dancing stopped instantly. The dancers looked upward with sleepy, startled eyes. The children awakened and frightened by the grind of an earthquake. They stared uncomprehendingly for a moment, half awake and wondering, before their reason came back, and then they scurried to the tied horses and began hooking up the surreys, fastening traces and tugs, backing their teams around the poles. The guitars stripped down the buntings and unused lanterns and slipped them into the saddlebags out of danger of the wet. In the barn, Burton arose to his feet and shouted triumphantly, "It's God's voice in anger!" And Thomas answered him, "Listen again, Burton. It's a thunderstorm." The glancing fires fell like rain from the great cloud now, and the air shook with the impact of thunder. In a few minutes the conveyances were moving out, a line of them toward the village of Our Lady, and a few toward the hill ranches. Canvases were up against the coming rain. The horses snorted at the battering of the air and tried to run. Since the beginning of the dance, the Wayne women had sat on Joseph's porch, holding a little aloof from the guests, as hostesses should. Alice had been unable to resist, and she had gone down to the dancing flat, but Elizabeth and Rama sat in rocking chairs and watched the fiesta. Now that they had put a cap over the sky, Rama stood up from her chair and prepared to go. "It was a curious thing," Rama said. "You've been quiet today, Elizabeth. Be sure you don't take cold." "I'm all right, Rama. I felt a little dull today with the excitement and the sadness. Ever since I can remember, parties have made me sad." All afternoon she had been watching Joseph, where he had stood apart from the dancers. She had seen him looking at the sky. Now he feels the rain. And when the thunder rolled over, Joseph will like that. Storms make him glad. Now that the people were gone, and the thunder had walked on over their heads, she continued to watch furtively the lonely figure of her husband. The vaqueros were hustling the utensils and the remaining food under cover. Joseph watched until the first rain began to fall, and then he sauntered to the porch and sat down on the top step in front of Elizabeth. His shoulders slumped forward and his elbow rested on his knees. Did you like the fiesta, Elizabeth? He asked. Yes. Did you ever see one before? I've seen fiestas before, she said, but never one quite like this. Do you think all the electricity in the air might have made the people wild? He turned about and looked into her face. More likely the wine in their stomachs, dear. His eyes narrowed seriously. You don't look well, Elizabeth. Are you feeling well? He stood up and leaned over her anxiously. Come inside, Elizabeth. It's getting too cold to sit out here. He went in ahead of her and lighted the lamp, hung from a chain in the center of the room, and then he built up a fire in the stove and opened the draft until it roared softly up the chimney. The rain swished gustily on the roof like a rough broom sweeping. In the kitchen, Alice was humming softly in memory of the dance. Elizabeth sat down heavily in a rocking chair by the stove. We'll have a little late supper, dear. Joseph knelt on the floor beside her. You look so tired, he said. It was all the excitement, all the people, and the music was, well, it was strenuous. She paused, trying to think what the music and dancing meant. It was such an odd day, she said. There was an outwardness, the people coming to the mass and the feasting and then the dance and last of all the storm. Am I being silly, Joseph, or was there a meaning right under the surface? It seemed like those pictures of simple landscapes they sell in the cities. When you look closely, you see all kinds of figures hidden in the lines. Do you know the kinds of pictures I mean? A rock becomes a sleeping wolf. A little cloud is a skull, and the line of trees marching soldiers when you look closely. Did the day seem like that to you, Joseph, full of hidden meanings not quite understandable? He was still kneeling, bending close to her in the low light of the lamp. He watched her lips intently, as though he could not hear. His hand stroked his beard roughly, and he nodded again and again. You see closely, Elizabeth, he said sharply. You look too deeply into things. And, Joseph, did you feel it? Didn't you? The meaning seemed to me to be a warning. Oh, I don't know how to say it. He dropped back and sat on his heels and stared at the specks of light that came back from the cracks in the stove. His left hand still caressed his beard, but his right moved up and rested on her knee. The wind cried shrilly in the oak tree over the house, and the stove ticked evenly as the fire died down a little. Alice sang, Corono alle de flores que es cosa mía. Joseph said softly, You see, Elizabeth, it should make me less lonely that you can see under the covering, but it doesn't. I want to tell you, and I can't. I don't think these are warnings to us, but only indications of how the world fares. A cloud is not a sign set up for men to see and to know that it will rain. Today was no warning. But you were right. I think there were things hidden in today. He licked his lips carefully. Elizabeth put out her hand to stroke his head. The dance was timeless, Joseph said. Do you know? A thing eternal, breaking through the vision for a day. He fell silent again and tried to back his mind out of the heavy and vague meanings that rolled about it like gray coils of fog. The people enjoyed it, he said. Everyone but Burton. Burton was miserable and afraid. I can never tell when Burton will be afraid. She watched how his lips curved up for a moment in faint amusement. Will you be hungry soon, dear? You can have your supper any time, just cold things tonight. These were words to keep a secret in, she knew, but the secret came sneaking out before she could stop it. Joseph, I was sick this morning. He looked at her compassionately. You worked too hard at the preparation. Yes, maybe, she said. No, Joseph, this isn't that. I didn't mean to tell you yet, but Rama says... Do you think Rama knows? Rama says she is never wrong, and Rama should know. She's seen enough, and she says she can tell. Joseph chuckled. What does Rama know? You'll choke yourself on words in a moment. Well, Rama says I'm going to have a baby. Her words fell into a curious silence. Joseph had settled back, and he was staring at the stove again. The rain had stopped for a moment, and Alice was not singing. Elizabeth gently, timorously, broke into the silence. Are you glad, dear? Joseph's breath broke heavily out. More glad than I have ever been, then in a whisper, and more afraid. What did you say, dear? What was that last? I didn't hear. He stood up and bent down over her. You must take care, he said sharply. I'll get a robe to go about your knees. Take care against the cold, care against falling. He tucked a blanket about her waist. She was smiling, proud of his glad and his sudden worry. I'll know what to do, dear. Don't fear for me. I'll know. Why, she said confidently, a whole plane of knowledge opens when a woman is carrying a child, Rama told me. See you take care, then, he repeated. She laughed happily. Is the child so precious to you already? She studied the floor and frowned. He studied the floor and frowned. Yes, the child is precious, but not so precious as the bearing of it. This is as real as a mountain. That is a tie to the earth. He stopped, thinking of the words for the feeling. It is a proof that we belong here, dear, my dear. The only proof that we are not strangers. He looked suddenly at the ceiling. The rain has stopped. I'll go and see how the horses are. Elizabeth laughed at him. Some place I've read or heard of a strange custom. Maybe it's in Norway or Russia. I don't know. But wherever it is, they say the cattle must be told. When anything happens in a family, a birth or a death, the father goes to the barn and tells the horses and the cows about it. Is that why you're going, Joseph? No, he said. I want to see all the halter ropes are short. Don't go, she begged. Thomas will look after the stock. He always does. Stay with me tonight. I'll be lonely if you go out tonight. Alice, she called, will you set the supper now? I want you to sit beside me, Joseph. She hugged his whole forearm against her breast. When I was little, a doll was given me, and when I saw it on the Christmas tree, an indescribable heat came into my heart. Before I ever took up the doll, I was afraid for it and filled with sorrow. I remember it so well. I was so sorry for the doll was mine. I don't know why. It seemed too precious, too agonizingly precious to be mine. It had real hair for eyebrows and real hair for lashes. Christmas has been like that every time since then, and this is a time like that. If this thing I have told you is true, it is too precious, and I am afraid. Sit with me, dear. Don't go walking in the hills tonight. He saw that there were tears in her eyes. Surely I'll stay, he comforted her. You are too tired, and you must go to bed early from now on. He sat with her all evening and went to bed with her, but when her breathing was even, he crept out and slipped on his clothes. She heard him going and lay still, pretending to be asleep. He has some business with the night, she thought, and her mind reverted to what Rama had said. If he dreams, you'll never know his dreams. She went cold with loneliness and shivered and began to cry softly. Joseph stepped quietly down from the porch. The sky had cleared and the night sharpened with frost. But the trees still dripped water, and from the roof a tiny stream fell to the ground. Joseph walked straight to the great oak and stood beneath it. He spoke very softly so no one could hear. There is to be a baby, sir. I promise that I will put it in your arms when it is born. He felt the cold, wet bark, drew his fingertips slowly downward. The priest knows, he thought. He knows part of it, but he doesn't believe. Or maybe he believes and is fearful. There's a storm coming, he said to the tree. I know I can't escape it, but you, sir, you might know how to protect us from the storm. For a long time he stood, moving his fingers nervously on the black bark. This thing is growing strong, he thought. I bet I began it because it comforted me when my father was dead, and now it has grown so strong that it overtops nearly everything, and it still comforts me. He walked to the barbecue pit and brought back a piece of meat that remained on the grate. There, he said, and reaching high up, laid the meat on the crotch of the tree. Protect us if you can, he begged. The thing that's coming may destroy us all. He was startled by footsteps near to him. Burton's voice said, Joseph, is it you? Yes, it's late. What do you want? Burton advanced and stood close. I want to talk to you, Joseph. I want to warn you. This is no time, Joseph said sullenly. Talk to me tomorrow. I've been out to look at the horses. Burton did not move. You are lying, Joseph. You think you have been secret, but I have watched you. I've seen you make offerings to the tree. I've seen the pagan growth in you, and I come to warn you. Burton was excited, and his breath came quick. You saw the wrath of God this afternoon, warning the idolaters. It was only a warning, Joseph. The lightning will strike next time. I've seen you creeping out to the tree, Joseph, and I've remembered Isaiah's words. You have left God, and his wrath will strike you down. He paused, breathless from the torrent of emotion, and the anger died out of him. Joseph, he began, come to the barn and pray with me. Christ will receive you back. Let us cut the tree down. But Joseph swung away from him and shook off the hand that was put out to restrain him. Save yourself, Burton, he laughed shortly. You're too serious, Burton. Now go to bed. Don't interfere with my games. Keep to your own. He left his brother standing there and crept back into the house. The politics of religion. So little has changed. So little has changed, if anything. The figurines, or the figures, the altar figures that they talk about that Father Angelo made, he's probably a Franciscan. There are the hinges that he describes were very, very common in Franciscan processional statuary. And there's a really beautiful piece The Cathedral of Christ the Light is a museum. It's a museum, and it's worth going to visit just to see the artwork that's there. And they have a Franciscan cross with a corpus on it, and it's a really interesting piece, really interesting piece. But it has the hinges and things on it. Very cool, very cool. And I've seen pieces in some antique shops. And it always makes me sad to see those pieces for sale in antique shops and people not really knowing much about them, because the history is so very rich, and not just talking about the history of the church, but the history of the craftsmanship that goes into them and the way that those items are made. They're quite beautiful. They're quite beautiful. Anyway, whatever is Burton gonna do? Stodgy old stick in the mud that he is. If he only knew how much he and Father Angelo had in common,